piercing through the darkness with the radiant light of truth. This is the Alchemical Lantern. Good evening, everyone. This is your host, Wayne McCroy. We are broadcasting live tonight on Free World FM as well as Rockfin. Tonight, we're going to discuss Prometheus and transhumanism. There's a conversation that has been recorded between one Mr. Bill Gates and one Mr. Ray Kurzweil. And this is how it goes, quote, this is Bill Gates speaking, quote, "So is there a God in this religion?" Then Ray Kurzweil answers and says, quote, "Not yet, but there will be." We're going to quote Greg Egan, author of Crystal Knights. Quote, "You know what they say the modern version of Pascal's wager is? Sucking up to as many transhumanists as possible, just in case one of them turns into God," end quote. And we're going to quote Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Quote, "You have evolved from worm to man, but much within you is still worm," end quote. And that is from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. People enjoy stories, apparently. Just look at human history, with all of its myths, poems, and legends. Alternatively, for the laziest among us, just skim through the list of movies and TV shows offered by Netflix, or the comic books published by Marvel and DC Comics. So stories are really part of our deep nature, and some of them can reveal something fundamental about us. And stories, or at least some of them, will definitely help us to understand the transhumanist narrative, as it represents the perfect fit for the legends and works of art that we are going to mention in this introduction. My favorite story, gonna pause for a second here, folks, not mine personally, but the author of the work we're reading from tonight, which for those interested is titled Transhumanism, Engineering the Human Condition, History, Philosophy, and Current Status, written by a man named Roberto Manzacco. So he goes on to mention his favorite story. My favorite story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, an ancient poem coming straight from Mesopotamia and considered by many specialists to be the earliest example of epic literature to have survived the ravages of time. But let's skip the philological details and jump into the core of the story. A story full of drama, blessed by a cinematic style, so much so that someone should try to adapt it into a movie, or even better, a TV series. Anyway, the main character is Gilgamesh, king of the Mesopotamian city of Uruk. The timing is unclear, but we know that different stories, dating back as far as 2100 BC, were merged together into a single poem, and the earliest available version of this poem was composed more or less during the 18th century BC. To make sure that the readers understand the real nature of Gilgamesh, which is that of a demigod, the poem stresses that our king is 1/3 human and 2/3 divine. In fact, he is the offspring of a goddess and a king, but this, of course, doesn't explain the weird proportion. Maybe someone here was not that good at math, or just wanted to underline that in Gilgamesh, the divine part was predominant. Full of energy and fury, our hero is oppressing his own people and forcing them into endless battles. To answer the lamentations of all of these young warriors' wives and girlfriends, the gods create a wild man, Enkidu, maybe the symbol of the original animal nature of humanity. Enkidu is tamed and thus civilized through sexual initiation by a prostitute. And so Gilgamesh finally finds someone able to stand up to him. The two fight, the king wins, and in the end, Gilgamesh and Enkidu become best friends. Of course, this is just the beginning, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu will work together to face many more challenges and journeys. Like the one to the Cedar Forest, a legendary place where the two kill its monstrous guardian, Humbaba, also known as the Terrible, and cut the sacred trees. What could possibly go wrong? Later on, the two troublemakers kill the Bull of Heaven, Sent to punish them by the goddess Ishtar. The main reason for this is actually the fact that Ishtar, a quite vindictive goddess, had her sexual advances dismissed by Gilgamesh. The gods decide to show their disapproval for the actions of the two, and as a form of retaliation, they sentence Enkidu to death. And this is when things start to become interesting. With the death of his best friend, Gilgamesh becomes aware for the first time of his own mortality. In spite of being 2/3 a god, he will have to surrender to the Grim Reaper. There is nothing he can do about that. Or maybe there is. There might be a man, Gilgamesh is told, that somehow managed to escape death. Just a rumor, but more than enough for Gilgamesh to undertake a long, lonely, and dangerous journey through the world with the purpose of finding the secret to a never-ending life. Do you see the pattern here? Since the very beginning of our written history, we can find narratives about human beings trying to defeat death. Not such a naive, childish dream, apparently, but a quintessential part of our cultural DNA. But let's go on with our story. Gilgamesh faces many dangers and has many fascinating adventures. He meets the Scorpion Men, creatures featured in the Babylonian version of the epic. He crosses the tunnel that the sun traverses during the night below the earth, which was flat according to the Sumerians, and so on. And in the end, Gilgamesh finally meets the first and only immortal human being. His name? Utnapishtim, a kind of Sumerian Noah, a man who survived the Great Flood the gods sent to punish humanity. Utnapishtim reveals his secret to Gilgamesh. The gods, repenting for the excessive harshness of the punishment they released upon humanity, decided altogether to make the Sumerian Babylonian Noah immortal as a form of compensation. This is far from good news for Gilgamesh. In fact, this is the bottom line. It would take a new general meeting of the gods, and so another great flood, to grant immortal life to Gilgamesh. As a consolation prize, Utnapishtim offers Gilgamesh a magical plant that will keep him young throughout his mortal life. But luck is not on our hero's side. While Gilgamesh is drinking water from a river, a snake steals the magical plant, and the only thing left for Gilgamesh is a sad return home. So I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Excuse me. So we see this little story of Gilgamesh already has the roots of what the promise of the transhumanist notion is here. Immortality, the defeat of death. You see, this is something that has been sought for a very long time, especially by those who hold philosophical knowledge, the knowledge of the ages, the secrets of the ages, those in the secret society groups and the fraternal occult brotherhoods, who have been hiding knowledge from mankind from the beginning. This is what they seek. This is their quest. It is the Holy Grail to them. It is the fulfillment of their great work, as they like to call it. Also referred to as the Philosopher's Stone, or the Stone of the Philosophers. Immortality. To defeat death, once and for all. In finality. Physical death, as well as spiritual death. That's what they seek. So let's continue reading here. For our purposes, other mythological and legendary figures are worth mentioning. One of them is a character belonging to Greek mythology and also very dear to many transhumanists, the Titan Prometheus. A true cultural hero credited with different things according to the different sources of the myth. So Prometheus is either the creator of humanity or the one who stole the fire from the gods to donate it to mankind, or the one who, against the gods' will, taught humanity all of the arts and the knowledge that they have. One way or the other, in the Western tradition, he became the symbol of both humanity striving for knowledge, progress, and civilization, and the risk of surpassing the limits set by the laws of nature, paying a price in terms of hubris and the related unintended, usually bad, consequences. During the Romantic era, Prometheus became the embodiment of the figure of solitary genius, whose attempts to create something great and to ameliorate the human condition would inevitably end up in tragedy. The classic history, as told for the first time by Hesiod, represents him punished by Zeus, king of the gods, bound to a rock with an eagle eating his liver every day, only to have it regrow every night, ready to be eaten again the following day forever. Prometheus's myth appeared for the first time in the 8th century BC, with his story told by the poet Hesiod in his Theogony. In this case, it has a happy ending. After a few years of punishment, another iconic Greek hero, Heracles, kills Zeus's eagle and frees Prometheus. Hesiod's epic is just one of the many poems and works of art devoted to Prometheus, and we have at least to mention the 5th century BC tragedy Prometheus Bound, in which Aeschylus widens the field of transgression perpetrated by the Titan against Zeus. Besides stealing the fire from the gods, Prometheus stands accused of such charges as teaching human beings arts like medicine, agriculture, mathematics, and so forth. So it is not a coincidence that in 1818 Mary Shelley chose for her novel Frankenstein the subtitle, The Modern Prometheus. Frankenstein is very important to us for many reasons. Unlike other novels of that age, the story told by Mary Shelley, who lived from 1797 till 1851, a young and ambitious scientist, Victor Frankenstein, decides to tinker with life itself and creates a monstrous but intelligent creature that in the end rebels against his own creator and all humankind. Is not based on magic or some other supernatural device. It is human science that decides to challenge the laws of nature in order to bring a human, if composite, being back to life. Yes, the idea for the novel came to Mary Shelley after a journey near Frankenstein Castle, where, a couple of centuries earlier, some obscure alchemist had attempted his own experiments. And yes, Shelley conceived her monster during a competition with authors like Polidori, Byron, and her future husband Percy Shelley to see who was capable of writing the best horror story. But the scientific background that she tried to give to her work qualifies it as the first modern science fiction novel, according to the sci-fi writer Brian Aldiss and others. Besides, to her contemporaries, Mary Shelley's idea of reanimating dead bodies using electricity would not have looked so extravagant, as shown by Sharon Rushton, who was the chair in Romanticism at Lancaster University, in her essay that she wrote called The Science of Life and Death in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In her paper, Rushton surveys the scientific background of Shelley's novel and shows us how one of the age's main obsessions was the difficulty of distinguishing clearly between the states of life and death and the connected fear of being buried alive. To study the phenomenon in 1774, two London physicians, Thomas Cogan and William Hawes, created the Royal Humane Society, whose initial name was the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. Every year, the society would organize a procession of those saved and reanimated by the two doctors' resuscitation methodology, among them Mary Shelley's mother. The success of the Royal Humane Society spread the idea that distinguishing between life and death was impossible and that rotting corpses excluded, everybody was at risk of being buried alive, a fact that even inspired a market for life-preserving coffins fully equipped with devices for easily opening them from the inside and holes for breathing. Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopedia distinguished between what it calls, quote, absolute death, characterized by a state of putrefaction, and incomplete death, comparable to states of coma, suspended animation, sleeping, and fainting. And of course, in the same years, someone even tried to animate truly dead animals and people. During the second half of the 18th century, the Italian scientist Luigi Galvani managed to make a dead frog's legs twitch using electricity, a phenomenon that came to be known as galvanism. Just as it would happen in a horror novel, and in some aspects in Shelley's novel itself, Galvani's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, tried to reanimate a human body, but more specifically the corpse belonging to a hanged criminal. A procedure allowed by the 1752 Murder Act, which established that a murderer's corpse could be dissected for research purposes. And incredible as it may sound, Aldini apparently succeeded, partially, as his corpse contorted its face, opened one eye, raised one hand, and moved its legs. During those years, the nature of life itself was open to debate, with a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, John Abernethy, defending the idea that life was a separate material substance, basically a vital principle, superadded to the organized body, an idea in line with all the fantasies about reanimating dead bodies through electricity. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Vital principle. This comes directly from the occult fraternities as well, the idea of the vital principle. And I think there's a core of truth to that, because we don't completely understand what it is, even unto today with our modern science, and they might claim that they have some closer idea, but they really don't know what differentiates a being from being living and dead. Take, for instance, somebody that's on life support. Their organs are functioning, and I guess by definition their body is alive, but nobody's home. Nobody's home. Does that qualify as living? Is there a live being in there? Sometimes not. Sometimes we've already checked out at that point. So there's something different, something intrinsically different to what makes life possible. And this is a problem for the mainline scientific community, especially those that pursue this transhumanist way of thinking. The ones that push the idea that you can upload your consciousness into a machine and live forever. Yes, they talk about that all the time. This is the promise that they give people. This is the ultimate goal of the transhumanists. They want to live forever. They think they could do it by transferring their consciousness into a machine. Is it truly that easy? I don't think it is. But they seem to think it's possible, as they attempt to quantify everything. Try to measure something like life essence as an objective measurement. Can't be done. Some things are subjective and experiential and cannot be measured objectively through scientific method. Yet they will attempt it anyway. If they come up with something that's a close approximation, it does give them some type of leverage or control to a certain degree, even though it may be inexact. But this is what they seek to do with these kinds of things, and they see electricity as being one of the key components to the puzzle here. And maybe there's something to that. Let's continue reading, though. As we are talking about people filled with hubris, can we really avoid mentioning Faust? Of course not. He is the protagonist of a popular German legend, apparently based on a semi-historical character, Johann Georg Faust, who was born more or less in 1480 and died more or less in 1540, even though some historians believe that this character actually represents the fusion of two different historical figures. At any rate, according to the classic legend, Faust is a charlatan, an astrologer, a magician, an alchemist, and a necromancer, very much dissatisfied with his life to the point that he sells his soul to the devil in exchange for superhuman knowledge, and of course a considerable amount of physical pleasure. His story inspired many kinds of artwork, ballads, novels, movies, and so on. Even better, his name became an adjective, Faustian, used to indicate any person who renounces their moral principles in order to achieve powers and knowledge normally forbidden to human beings. A fact that, besides the moral part, transhumanists talk a lot about ethics. Looks very transhumanist. With a side effect, though, normally, Faustian characters end up losing their soul, of course. It was in the contract, and burning in hell forever and ever. Anyway, the adaptations of the Legend of Faust that were worth mentioning are, of course, Christopher Marlowe's The Tragic History of Dr. Faustus, a play likely published around 1587. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, a play in 2 parts, published between 1808 and 1832, and probably the most popular one we have today on Faust, as far as the story goes. And Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, a novel published in 1947. Mann's novel represents a reframing of this old legend and its adaptation to modern times. The novel tells the story of a fictional musician, Adrian Leverkuhn, who sells his soul and his sanity to the devil in exchange for 24 years of superhuman creativity. The description, or actual lack of it, of what awaits every Faustian transhumanist in hell is particularly effective. And this is a quote directly from that novel, Dr. Faustus, written by Thomas Mann. Quote, "That is the secret delight and security of hell, that it cannot be denounced, that it lies hidden from language, that it simply is but cannot appear in a newspaper, be made public, be brought to critical notice by words, which is why the words subterranean, cellar, thick walls, soundlessness, oblivion, hopelessness are but weak symbols. That is what the newcomer first experiences, and what he at first cannot grasp with his, so to speak, healthy senses, and will not understand because reason, or whatever limitation of the understanding it may be, prevents him from doing so. In short, because it is unbelievable, so unbelievable that it turns a man chalk white. Unbelievable, although in the very greeting upon arrival it is revealed in a concise and most forcible form that here all things cease. Every mercy, every grace, every forbearance, every last trace of consideration for the beseeching, unbelieving objection. You really cannot do that with a soul. But it is done, it happens, and without a word of accountability, in the sound-tight cellar, deep below God's hearing, and indeed for all eternity." End quote. Excuse me. Of course, this will not stop the transhumanists for the following fundamental reason. Transhumanists are not the religious types, at least in most cases, and to them the idea of hubris is nothing to be ashamed of. On the contrary, floating in a sea of nihilism, transhumanism sees in hubris the only hope of salvation, the only chance human beings have of avoiding something that they fear even more than an imaginary hell, pure nothingness. Going to continue on here. What I would like to stress here is the complete overturn of the traditional hubristic narrative, so radical that to the transhumanist mindset, characters like Gilgamesh, Prometheus, Victor Frankenstein, and Faust would unquestionably be seen as positive figures. So let's press the forward button and take a look at a contemporary tale written by one of the most prominent transhumanist thinkers, one Mr. Nick Bostrom. And he wrote a story here called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant. And in this, it begins, quote, "Once upon a time," the tale begins, "the planet was tyrannized by a giant dragon. The dragon stood taller than the largest cathedral, and it was covered with thick black scales. Its red eyes glowed with hate, and from its terrible jaws flowed an incessant stream of evil, smelling yellowish-green slime. It demanded from humankind a blood-curdling tribute to satisfy its enormous appetite. 10,000 men and women had to be delivered every evening at the onset of dark to the foot of the mountain where the dragon tyrant lived. Sometimes the dragon would devour these unfortunate souls upon arrival. Sometimes again it would lock them up in the mountain where they would wither away for months or years before eventually being consumed." End quote. A pretty horrifying story, if you ask me. In the imaginary world depicted by Bostrom, tens of thousands of human beings die every day, which is exactly what happens in our world. In fact, as you've probably already figured out, the dragon tyrant is none other than the personification of the aging process and, of course, death. The rest of the story represents step by step the actual struggle of humanity, existential, religious, psychological, and technological, to fight mortality, to cope with it, to accept it, and at least if you are a transhumanist, to ultimately defeat it. And of course, just like every fairy tale worth its name, and unlike classic moral fables, this fable has a happy ending, which is exactly what transhumanists expect. A never-ending happily ever after. In fact, after musings, reflections, meetings, and so on, the king and his people figure out a way to defeat the horrible monster that mortality is. They build, after many attempts, a superweapon and kill the dragon tyrant. The moral that we can extract from this transhumanist fable is quite straightforward. Aging and death are bad, period. We could not do anything about it for the better part of human history, except accept it and rationalize it. But now things are changing, and technology is about to make the defeat of the dragon tyrant possible, or at least thinkable. And this can be done only collectively, if we get rid of our religion-bound hubris mentality and decide that we have nothing to lose but our beliefs of a punishment for our own arrogance in an afterlife that probably does not even exist. Even worse, stories like the ones mankind's main religions tell are not harmless. Their acceptance-based mentality actually represents a concrete obstacle for the development of weapons capable of killing the dragon tyrant. The fable ends with the king musing and talking about the need for the whole society to reorganize. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. What do you think's going on in the world today? They're trying to reorganize the society. They really think they can achieve this transhumanist goal. There's people in positions of power in this world that very much have latched onto this idea and are wholeheartedly pursuing it because they see it being closer to fruition than ever before in the history of mankind, with many of our modern technologies at play here. So even though we have a poor understanding of what consciousness really is, what soul or spirit really is, and how life is related to this, even though we have a very poor concept of this, they think they could break it down to the physical nuts and bolts of machinery, turn it into something objectively measurable, and control it in some way. And this is what they seek to do, and with enough advances in technology, they think it can be done. And they're pushing for that very furiously right now. But is it really possible? Is it really possible? So you see the intrinsic ties back to the mythology of yesteryear. Things like Prometheus and Gilgamesh. Prometheus in particular, because this is one of the keys to getting people to buy the whole transhumanist notion. The archetype that is Prometheus. It's something intrinsic in the human psyche, an archetype. And this Prometheus archetype is definitely there. And these social engineers of this world that are pushing this transhumanist notion, they seek to leverage off of that desire in the human being. Leverage off of the human's fear of death and their desire for eternal life. They manipulate that and play upon that. And they've introduced a new god into the modern lexicon. And of course that god is science, technology. That is what they deify now. They see this as being humanity's only hope. Let's continue reading, though. There's still some important points to make here. Surely, defeating individual death is not and cannot be the only goal for transhumanists. After all, if you are planning to stay around for at least a few billion years, eventually you will have to face the issue of the death of the sun, and after that the thermal death of the universe, which right now seems the most likely scenario. This brings us to another fable, courtesy of a well-known postmodern philosopher, Jean-François Lyotard. Trigger warning, in his most famous book, La Condition Postmoderne, Leotard defines the concept of postmodern as, quote, incredulity towards meta-narratives, end quote. These are large-scale visions of the world, scientific theories, and philosophical systems about the world as a whole. For example, the idea that science will be able to answer every question and know everything, the belief in the possibility of absolute freedom, the concept of unstoppable progress, and so forth. So, Leotard seems to disqualify the transhumanist dreams as mere meta-narratives. And in this case, let me stress the abysmal difference between disqualify and debunk. In some of his writings, Leotard outlines a postmodern fable that he thinks constitutes the real fabric of the contemporary human techno-scientific endeavor. An implicit story that, maybe unconsciously, we, the postmoderns, like to tell ourselves. Let's call it the fable of negentropy. So let's imagine a very distant future, says Leotard, in which our sun, reaching the end of its life cycle, will turn into a nova and destroy everything around it, including our beloved home, the planet Earth. Besides Leotard's scientific error, technically the sun will turn not into a nova, but rather a red giant, swallowing many planets in the process, and then into a small, super-dense white dwarf. The concept is very clear. Life is going to end in our system, no matter what. It will die. That's what counts. Are we still going to be around? We or our post-human descendants? If this is the case, how are we going to get out of this? Anyway, according to Leotard, quote, the narrative of the end of the Earth is not in itself fictional, it's really rather realistic. Something ought to escape the conflagration of the systems and its ashes. The fable hesitates to name the thing that ought to survive. Is it the human and his or her brain, or the brain and its human? And finally, how are we to understand the ought to escape? Is it a need, an obligation, an eventuality? There remains much to be done. Human beings must change a lot to get there. The fable says that they can get there eventually, that they are urged to do so, or to do it, the need to do that doing it is in their interest or their obligation. But the fable cannot say what human beings will have become then, end quote. And it seems that the end of the world as we know it, plus the possible end of the human mind itself in the far future, is going to constitute a huge philosophical problem. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So basically, what this guy is postulating and pointing out is, excuse me, despite potentially achieving immortality, mankind has not really achieved immortality. That's what's being said here. So, that being the case, they really think they know enough about the universe and how it operates to know that in billions and billions of years it will end, and when it does end, then we're gone as well. Because we can't exist in this frozen state, the way they describe it here, the thermodynamic impact of the death of the universe, the death of solar system, of stars, all these things they describe. It is a very science fiction-y sounding type scenario, isn't it? Certainly it is. But even in their hubris of thinking they understand how all this works, they could be mistaken about that as well. I don't know. I don't claim to have the answers, but at any rate, the whole notion here is the transhumanists will eventually die anyway, even if they believe in all of their own theories that they put out there, even if they believe the modern science. An end will come. This is something that's promised. It's natural law. In order to stave this off, it would require breaking natural law or inverting natural law. And that does not seem to be something that goes over well in this place that we live in. The attempt to do so. Nature always self-corrects. And something like this, I think, is no different. I don't think they'll be able to achieve such a post-human reality, like they like to talk about. This transhumanist notion of advancing to such a state of technology where we could transfer our consciousness into innumerable different receptacles and exist therein, live forever, and be godlike in our abilities. I don't think it's feasible. I think it's a pipe dream. But let's continue reading here. It's impossible to think an end, pure and simple, of anything at all, since the end's limit, and to think that you have to be on both sides of that limit. So what's finished or finite has to be perpetuated in our thought if it's to be thought of as finished. Now, this is true of limits belonging to thought, but after the sun's death, there won't be a thought to know that its death took place. That, in my view, is the sole serious question to face humanity today. In 4.5 billion years, there will arrive the demise of your phenomenology and your utopian politics, and there will be no one there to toll the death knell or hear it. It will be too late to understand that your passionate, endless questioning always depended on a life of the mind that will have been nothing else than a covert form of earthly life. A form of life that was spiritual because human, and human because earthly, coming from the earth of the most living of living things. With the disappearance of earth, thought will have stopped, leaving that disappearance absolutely unthought of. And I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks. So when there's nobody around to have any thoughts, will there be death? Or will there be nothingness? Now, the author of this work said earlier that the most frightening concept for most of the transhumanists is not even, say, existence or eternal torment in hell, but a state of being of absolute nothingness. See, and this goes back to the ages-old question of what is consciousness? What is life? What is consciousness? We think, we feel. Does that cease? And these questions have haunted humanity from time immemorial. So here's the thing. Even if you could somehow extend your physical life here, will that extend your thinking life? Will your mind continue on here in the physical as well? Or will it deteriorate over time? Our mind and the physical body, are they one and the same? I don't think they are, folks. I think mind and the brain are two separate things. The brain is the physical tool that helps to manifest mind here in this reality. It's a transceiver of sorts. I don't think that the brain itself is the source of consciousness. I think it's just a tool that helps to translate consciousness into the physical world here. But consciousness, in my view, I think is something that lives on outside of this realm and this physical place, this universe as they describe it, these solar systems. And they're talking about this death of the sun, of the solar system, of the universe at large. So if you were to achieve this immortality, would it actually last? Is it true immortality if all things, according to them and their science, are going to end at some point? Is that truly immortality? It's still a finite space of existence. Or will it all devolve into nothingness, much like they tend to fear? So you can see there's an awful lot of flaws and problems with the way they think to begin with. Will they perceive the passage of time differently if they're able to achieve their transhumanist goals? That's another question. We see in the Bible always, and within theology, theological representations, as well as philosophical ones, that they equate 1,000 years to a day in the Bible in the creation story. Would it be possible that the same or a similar type of a phenomenon would happen at some point if you were to live long enough? Would you perceive time differently? If you had an extended lifespan? If the hours of your day were extended? If you didn't have a need for sleep like you do? But see, that's the other question. What exactly is sleep and how does it relate here? What happens to consciousness during sleep? See, these are all questions that the transhumanists have no true answer for. They want to try to quantify everything and make it feasible through technology, but it just simply is not something that we know enough about or can understand through scientific method. It's not something objectively measurable, but they try to make it so. And if they could get enough people to believe that this thing is objectively measurable, that consciousness itself is something that could be objectively measured, they could get people to buy into this notion just based upon the Promethean idea attached to it. It's something inherent in human consciousness. We want to try to extend our lives, live forever, and defeat death, because death is the great equalizer. And that is something that terrifies these people in positions of power, these prominent families and secret society groups that have elevated their members to the highest levels in society here, this elite ruling class that they like to think of themselves as. They call themselves the Olympians. They think themselves godlike already with their intellect and their intelligence. They think they have the divine right to rule over the rest of us. And they put these beliefs into practice in the things that they do. And it terrifies them to think that at some point they may be answerable to a higher power. So they want to extend their lives as long as they possibly can and eventually try to live forever in this physical plane of existence. That way, that shields them from being answerable to some higher power, and they then become the higher power themselves. That's their dream, that's their goal, that's the fruition of their great work, the Philosopher's Stone. Let's continue reading, though, and we'll wrap up here very soon. The sun, our earth, and your thought will have been no more than a spasmodic state of energy, an instant of established order, a smile on the surface of matter, in a remote corner of the cosmos. You, the unbelievers, you're really believers, you believe much too much in that smile, in the complicity of things and thought, in the purposefulness of all things. Once we were considered able to converse with nature. Matter asks no questions, expects no answers of us. It ignores us. It made us the way it made all bodies, by chance and according to its laws, or else you try to anticipate the disaster and fend it off, with means belonging to that category, means that are those of the laws of the transformation of energy. You decide to accept the challenge of the extremely likely annihilation of a solar order and an order of your own thought. Human thought works analogically, according to Lyotard, not just logically, and this way of thinking depends on a body and its correlation with a reality that is perceived as inexhaustible. Even more, human thinking is inextricably tied to two other human endowments: the ability to feel pain, no pain, no gain, we could say, even in the field of thinking, and, most importantly, philosophizing, and the ability to desire. Will our descendants be able to build machines bearing consciousness, able to think logically and analogically, and to feel pain and desire? And here is where the issue of complexity has to be brought up again. I'm granting to physics theory that technological scientific development is, on the surface of the Earth, the present-day form of a process of negentropy, or complexification that has been underway since the Earth began its existence. I'm granting that human beings aren't and never have been the motor of this complexification, but an effect and carrier of this negentropy, its continuer. I'm granting that the disembodied intelligence that everything here conspires to create will make it possible to meet the challenge to that process of complexification posed by an entropic tidal wave, which, from that standpoint, equates with the solar explosion to come. I agree that with the cosmic exile of this intelligence, a locus of high complexity, a center of negentropy, will have escaped its most probable outcome, a fate promised any isolated system by Carnot's second law, precisely because this intelligence won't have let itself be left isolated in its terrestrial solar condition. In granting all this, I concede that it isn't any human desire to know or transform reality that propels this techno-science, but a cosmic circumstance. But note that the complexity of that intelligence exceeds that of the most sophisticated logical systems, since it's another type of thing entirely. As a material ensemble, the human body hinders the separability of this intelligence, hinders its exile and therefore survival. But at the same time, the body, our phenomenological, mortal, perceiving body, is the only available analogon for thinking a certain complexity of thought. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. This guy likes to use a lot of big words, but basically he's saying we don't know what happens after the body dies, that we need the body in order to have thought, to experience consciousness, and without the body, we're not sure what happens. That's essentially what he's saying. But let's continue on, and we'll wrap it up here very soon. To sum it up, in the natural world, entropy, that is, disorder, tends naturally to increase, but there are pieces of this world in which exactly the opposite happens. That is, order, or negentropy, increases. For example, the evolutionary process somehow represents a negentropic wave that creates growing tides of order and complexity. As far as we know, the final battle between entropy and negentropy will be won by the former, even though science fiction, which Lyotard is probably not very fond of, has offered us some possible, indeed imaginative solutions. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. So, the transhumanists and most of the quote-unquote science crowd seem to believe in the idea of evolution, Darwinian evolution, and this is a core tenet of many of their beliefs. And this is also one of the pillars that crumbles under the weight of its own claims, because it's never been verified, never been proven, although they will tell you time and again it is a fact. When it is not, it is a theory, and not a very good one at that. Darwinian evolution. So this is all based upon Darwinian evolution. So they think that this negentropic wave, as they like to call it, happens due to evolution. That order increases through time in direct violation of the law of entropy. And this is a proven facet of the natural world, entropy. Things break down over time. They don't get better. They don't create more order and complexity through time. That's something that has never, ever been proven or satisfactorily demonstrated, especially when it comes to terms like evolution. Yes, there happen to be some mutations, but nobody's ever seen something new, more complex, develop or evolve from something else. This has never been demonstrated. They'll put together some weak circumstantial evidence to try to prove their point, but this is little more than rhetoric. It is not absolute proof or absolute fact the way that they present it. And this whole notion that evolution can overcome entropy and create this negentropy where things become more complicated, more complex through time, more sophisticated. And remember, complexity doesn't make it better, does it? Oftentimes, complexity makes something more difficult. Complexity makes something more prone to breakdowns. Complexity makes something more prone to faults, more prone to weakness. Think about that. Understand that. So the argument is the more complexity, the more evolution, the better, the more order. And this is how we conquer death and the grave. Through complexity science, which is another term for, wait for it, cybernetics, complexity. So this is the argument made by the transhumanists. It's our destiny due to evolution to achieve this negentropy, this opposition to entropy, the breaking down of things over time, to become more complex, to become more ordered. And of course, it's always about order out of chaos with these people. Where do you think the transhumanist notion was born from? It comes directly from the old mystery schools of antiquity, the secret society groups, the occult fraternities. You know, the ones that give this reverence to Prometheus. Prometheus, the figure that brought us the fire from the gods. This mythological figure, this archetype within the human psyche that they like to manipulate. They do like to manipulate people with this. In fact, if you've ever seen the movie Prometheus, which was, I guess, one of the ones in the Alien series of movies, if I'm not mistaken, they represent Prometheus as an alien species here, which seeded the Earth, and all of these various things that you'll hear on the old History Channel Ancient Astronauts show. All these same notions being pushed by all of these groups that support some of these transhumanist narratives and ways of thinking. Now, can technology do some wonderful things and help people in innumerable ways? Yes, it certainly can. It's a tool like everything else. Problem is, the people controlling these tools right now, well, they're a bunch of raving psychopaths, first and foremost. Second of all, they have ill intention in mind for the bulk of the masses with it. And they intend to use the good benefits of it for themselves only. They have no place for the profane in their new world order. Understand that, and you and I are the profane, according to these people. There's no place for the profane in their new world order. It's been said, and I don't know how true this is, but many people quote Henry Kissinger as having said that when the New World Order comes into being, many people will have died, but things will be so much better for those who have survived. That's a paraphrase. I don't remember what the exact quote is supposedly supposed to be. I don't even know if it's a real quote from him. But this is the attitude that these people espouse. You have to break some eggs to make an omelet. That's how they see it. And of course, they have no compunction with breaking the eggs that are the profane in their eyes. If you're not in the big club, you're one of the profane. It's only for those super elect that the benefits of this transhumanist scheme are supposed to be for. But they, like I said, they have no compunction with experimenting on the masses with this stuff in order to perfect it. And that's what they're up to in the modern age. It's all about transhumanism. Transhumanism is the big granddaddy of all conspiracies that underlies everything in this world. Everything. It can be traced all the way back as far as we could go in history, the roots of it. As I've demonstrated before, if you've listened to any of my content before, you'll see Whenever you look at these things, they always invariably end up in two places. If you go back as far in time as you possibly can, you will always find the occult and the mystery schools and these secret fraternities and brotherhoods that still exist today and pass on this knowledge to today. And if you go to the other end of the spectrum and look forward into the future, you will always invariably find the transhumanist future, the post-humanist ideology, this whole idea of what they call singularity, this merging of man with machine and becoming gods, the deification of man, the apotheosis, the fulfillment of the great work, in their view. And it's all been twisted and contorted from time immemorial unto today, and everything's about the inversion principle. Inverting natural law, inverting the natural order. That's what these technocrats, let's call them for what they are, technocrats, cryptocrats, there's a lot of different designations you could give to these people. The dark occultists at the top of the power structure, that's what they seek. Total inversion of the natural order so that they could create their own order, a new world order, if you will, and control that and be the gods of that. And they're pushing very hard right now. They see that being achievable within the very near future with the current state of technology. But let me tell you, folks, there's nothing new under the sun. We're advised this in the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. All this has been done before. All this has been happening before. In past times, we've always had these same type of people seeking the overthrow of the natural order, seeking to replace God and become God themselves, thinking they can do better. But let me tell you, no created thing can ever be greater than its creator. And although these people try and try, it's destined to fail miserably, catastrophically. That's why we're given the example of the story of the Tower of Babel in the Bible. This is what happens. The natural world will correct what's been done here in opposition or inversion to it. God is not mocked. Remember that. These people, they mock God in their actions. They mock God in the things that they do and the things that they want to achieve. And it will crumble catastrophically under the weight of its own hubris, this whole transhumanist notion. So even if it does succeed to some degree, it will only last for a very short time before it crumbles under the weight of its own hubris. You see, in order to go against the natural processes, you invoke this law of entropy. All things break down over time, and the bigger the system you have in place, the more maintenance it requires to stave off this entropy, and the more energy it requires to do that. And at some point, because we exist in this place, made by our Creator, things do break down over time. This law of entropy does take hold. And at some point, they can't maintain it any longer, and it crumbles. Because the energy needs are too great to maintain this opposition to the natural laws of things. So the transhumanist notion, in my estimation, is a pipe dream, and although maybe they may possibly pull off some portion thereof, even if they do succeed, it will be very short-lived, for we have another Tower of Babel moment coming if these people manage to succeed in what they're doing. But there's a great awakening going on right now, and they're not getting away with things like they once were, and they're getting nervous, they're having a lot more backlash and pushback than they anticipated. People are waking up in droves to the nonsense and the corruption that's been going on, and they've had enough. And nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. And people are fed up with these technocrats running the show and doing things that violate our best interests. So the transhumanist notion of things, it's not going to stand, folks. Prometheus, this archetype has been invoked, but it's not going to last. Plain and simple, it won't stand simply because they invoke the archetype and try to make it happen. That's all the time we have for tonight, folks. We'll catch you next week here on the Alchemical Lantern. Have a good night now.